Hello friends, welcome to the EduSat Network. Today we are going to discuss the beginnings of American literature. This lecture is our first lecture in our series, which we have of course, as I said, begun today, our series on American literature. And for this discussion we have this in the studio, Dr. Bhim Singh Daya. He has taught English literature for over 4 decades in different universities in India and abroad. After a long stint as Professor of English and Vice Chancellor of Kurukshetra University, Kurukshetra, Dr. Daya is presently acting as an advisor to a well-known university in India, and we're of course very privileged to have him here with us today. Welcome, sir, and I would request you to begin the lecture.
Thank you. Well, beginnings of American literature, as you know, every literature is a reflection of life, and life obviously of the people where it has been produced. Now there is a history attached to every literature. It may be British, Indian or American. It is bound to reflect the history of the society, of the nation where it has been produced. So America has its own history, which it is very important to know before you can comprehend what American literature is and how it began and what were the sources out of which it came. Well, to begin with, we must know that America was discovered in 1498 by Christopher Columbus, who was an Italian navigator. But this discovery actually was rediscovery. For the Europeans it was a discovery, but as Chris Harman, one of the leading British historian, who has done a book called People's History of the World, he says the Asians had discovered America 2000 years ago, because the natives of America, when these Europeans went in the 16th century, were already there, Red Indians. Then the Spanish-speaking people in South America, even they came before the British. But there were the natives both in North and South America who had gone from Asia, mostly from India and China. And they had gone there 2000 years ago. Now when the Europeans came in the 16th, 17th century, they suppressed these people, killed them, and brutally subjugated and converted it into a colony. This was the time when Europe was going out to colonize the world. It started in the late 16th century. 1599, you would recall, Queen Elizabeth signed a treaty with the Mughal Empire, Jahangir, for the trade with England. And this was assigned to a private company called East India Company. And that East India Company finally colonized India after 1757, the Battle of Plassey. Similarly, in the later years of Queen Elizabeth, the British reached America also. The first state they reached was Virginia, and of course the northeastern states along the Atlantic, which they later called New England, because it was England-like and because they occupied it, therefore they called it New England, northeastern states, like Massachusetts. And Boston, the coastal city, That became the spiritual capital of New England. Now, the British, of course, were not the first Europeans to reach America. Before the British, it were the Spanish people and the French who had reached America. They occupied parts of it, but when the British went in 1607 and thereafter, you see, they fought with these people and finally they were victorious and they converted America into a colony. The Spanish people were pushed down into the south of America. So even today, you know, the South American states are Spanish speaking, but North America is English speaking because of the British occupation. Now, this had started in the 17th century, as I said, but the real occupation came when the British in a big way reached there. And as it is generally said in history, the unsettlement of Europe brought about the settlement of America. Now, unsettlement was, there was a fierce war all over Europe between the Catholics and the Protestants. If you remember, 17th century was the time when Reformation came about in Europe. And there were the two leading figures who launched this reformist movement in Christian religion. They were Martin Luther at Wittenberg. He was professor of theology at Wittenberg. Just to remind you for reference, Hamlet is studying at Wittenberg, and it was Shakespeare's time almost when Martin Luther was there at Wittenberg. And the other was Calvin. Most people who went to America were followers of Calvin, and it was the Calvinist branch of Christianity which became the religion of the Americans. Now, in this fierce war between the Orthodox Catholics and the Reformist Puritans, also called Protestants, ultimately all kings of Europe, they sided with the medieval Catholicism, because during the medieval period the entire Europe was governed by the Church of Rome. So Church of Rome was supreme. No king could take any decision without the permission of the church. But then with the Protestants came the defiance of the church. If you remember, Henry VIII, before Queen Elizabeth, because he was not allowed to divorce his first wife, so he revolted against the Church of Rome and set up his own Anglican church in England. And entire England became Protestant during the time of Henry VIII, father of Queen Elizabeth. So this war was going on all over Europe, and because the armies were on the Orthodox side, Catholics, so Protestants had to flee Europe. They had to save their lives. Millions of them were killed, but millions of them escaped also. And America, being the new and distant land, almost a forest, they escaped into it. That is how the settlement of America came about. The process started in a big way in 1607, and it continued throughout 17th century and part of the 18th also, because America was a big continent and all forest, no habitation except handful of Red Indians who were living in the forests, hardly any town, any city. It were the Europeans who set up cities and cleared the forests. It took 200 years for them to clear the frontier and set up cities and industry and agriculture and so on. So it became a British colony. Now America culturally came to be divided into three parts. One is called, even today, New England, which means northeastern states, including Massachusetts, New Hampshire, etc., Rhode Island. Then the middle colonies, which means these days it is called Midwest, but those days they were called middle colonies. And the third was the South. Now these were three distinct segments of America at that time. In the first segment, New England, it were the Puritans, Calvinists, who were dominant, and they set up a society of their own. And they said they wanted to set up a society after the Word of God, Bible, a pure Puritan society with free will, so on and so forth. And in the middle colonies portion of America, Quakers were dominant. Quakers was another sect of Christianity. Now these Quakers were not staunch believers like the Puritans. They were called pacifists and humanitarian and also rationalists. Sorry. So they were very different sort of people, not as staunch Christians as the Puritans were. That's why Puritans in the New England terrain, they committed a lot of crimes. They were intolerant and they killed all those who were not believers in Calvinism. Whereas these Quakers, they did not kill anyone. They wanted to live peacefully with other faiths also. That was a big difference. Now third was the South. In the South you had mostly conservative peasants, not much education, not many schools or colleges, and they were just clearing the land for agriculture. And even today it continues to be an agriculture-based, agrarian part of America, South America. At that time, you see, this conservatism, if you remember, ultimately led to civil war. 1865, Abraham Lincoln, because he wanted to abolish slavery of the black people, Negroes. But the South resisted. The conservative, they wanted to remain in the same orthodox lifestyle, landlords having slaves to work for them and so on. So the war came. Ultimately, of course, Abraham Lincoln won the war and slavery was abolished, although in the process he had to sacrifice his own life. So South was conservative. Now, before America got freedom in 1776, the American War of Independence, if you remember, continued for 4 years, started in 73, 74, 75, 76, July 4, you remember, Independence Day of America, 4th July, tomorrow, yes, 1776. So they got independence. this period, when the settlement of America came about in 1607 and 1706, when it became a free country, an independent country with its own identity, this about 150 years or more was the colonial period. And during the colonial period, the British, of course, wouldn't be interested in educating them, setting up universities, or trying to even know what kind of literature they were producing. So mostly it was a local sort of literature. And the literature of these three distinct segments of America were also different in character. As I said, the New England literature was Puritan through and through. Two important names that come to my mind. One was Jonathan Edwards. And the other was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin later, of course, was an important leader in the nationalist movement also. But these two Puritan writers emerged as the leading ones. And the kind of books they wrote were based on the Bible. For example, the concept of the free will, or concept of the fallen man, because the Puritans believed that man by birth is fallen. Adam and Eve story. Because of that, the first man fell, therefore everybody is fallen. So he is a sinner, and he has to redeem himself by following the dictate of God, which means living life or molding life according to the Bible. So it were this kind of books that they wrote, both Edwards as well as Benjamin Franklin. Now, as for the middle colonies, where we had the Quakers, so Quakers also had their own writings, but very different. For example, their leading writer was William Penn, P-E-N-N. Penn, by the way, is also a short name for Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania was one of the leading states in this middle portion of America, middle colonies. And he wrote very different kind of books. For example, he wrote on the slavery system, and he wanted this to go, or at least treat the slaves as humans. Similarly, he wrote a book on the treatment of the poor. And third, he wrote a book on liberalism. So very different philosophy altogether. And in fact, he also wrote against anti-Calvinism, anti-Puritanism, which was rather fanatical. So the middle colonies of America, because of the Quaker influence, which was pacifism, which was humanitarianism, which was liberalism, they produced a very different kind of culture. And even today, it is this middle America which actually is the backbone, industrial, cultural, educational, it is all there, they say. All your big universities, they are in this part, of course. Now New England also, Harvard, Yale, and so on. As for the third, the southern part of America, as I said, it was conservative, and it continued to be conservative for a long, long time, for many centuries. Even today, compared to the other two segments, it is conservative. So the literature also that they produce, one of the important writers was Cotton Mather, C-O-T-T-O-N, M-A-T-H-E-R-S, Cotton Mather's. He wrote sort of histories of, say, its own states, southern states, cities, states, like history of Maryland or history of Virginia, this kind of. Other writers also, they wrote chronicles, like another was William Sparks. William Sparks also wrote chronicles and histories. So three different cultures producing three different literatures. That is how literature before America got independence continued. Of course, there comes another small period before independence and after these beginnings. Like you have an important name called who wrote leather stocking novels. That was about the pioneer. In fact, one of the novels was Pioneer. Cooper. Cooper was the novelist. So he was the first major novelist of America. Later, of course, you had so many. But then he made a beginning during this colonial period itself. And he wrote about the American settlers, how they came and what kind of rough life they had to live and what kind of problems they had to face. So they are called leather stocking novels, and the kind of confrontations they had with the Red Indians and how they subdued them. So all this is captured in the narratives here of Cooper's novels. Before him, of course, there was another who wrote Gothic stories, forgetting his name. Gothic stories, very much imitating the Gothic novel in Europe. Even later in the 19th century, Edgar Allan Poe, you remember,
Yes.
he wrote those stories and so on. But roughly speaking, this was the kind of literature which came out in the first phase of American literary history, and this was the colonial period, and you can say it was not pan-American literature, it was local literature of three different regions having three different characteristics. That's how it went.
Right, sir. So, of course, we would be continuing our discussion on the beginnings of
Sure.
American literature, and I would like to perhaps ask you a few questions
Sure.
that have come in my mind. Sir, as you were mentioning that Boston became the spiritual capital during the time when it was colonized, say, by the British, and then a lot of printing presses, the beginning of printing presses happened in that area. So can we say that the large part of the literature that was produced in the beginning of, say, American literature was from the East Coast area, or was it equally distributed in the three parts that we discussed?
Not really equally. North had an edge. One reason was because it was closest to Europe.
Okay.
And Boston, you see, I also went to Boston when I first went to America. When you come from Europe, that is where you hit the first city, first settlement. So these Europeans could easily bring their printing presses and so on to this part, whereas going to the extreme west, like California, etc., or going to the south, Virginia and other states, like Miami, the extreme coastal city in which state is it? Of the South, last beyond Virginia.
Texas?
Texas, yeah. Texas, of course, is deep south, but Miami is at the end. You have then the
Florida.
Cuban, Florida, sorry, a very important state. All tourists go there.
Yes.
So obviously they had an advantage because of their proximity to Europe. They were the first to get whatever came from Europe, and their entire civilization, not only press, it came from Europe. It was being transferred, and they being the first would get the first benefit. Then it will go to the middle, and last of all, it will go to the south.
Right.
That's why South continued to be backward and conservative.
Right. So as you said, Boston, it's because of its proximity also to England, and also England could make use of its printing press set up in Cambridge and their colleges there.
Yes, and in fact, they call them Pilgrim Fathers. The first Puritan settlers who came from Europe, largely England, they came to Boston. So that is why it became the spiritual capital, because these Pilgrim Fathers who then controlled the religious life in New England, you see, they settled in Boston, set up their churches there, and it became obviously the spiritual capital of New England and largely of America itself.
Right, sir. And again, can we say that in the beginning, the very topics that people took up for writing were mainly they talked about religious disputes, or they took up writing Puritan poetry in the beginnings?
Of course, that is problem with any theological society, because religion is so domineering as it was during the medieval period. There is hardly any literature worth the name during those 8-9 centuries of the medieval times, because they would not allow you to write freely.
Right.
You have to write whatever the Bible says. So you can illustrate Bible, you can sing in praise of Bible, but you cannot write freely of your own will.
Right.
So similarly, the Puritans would not permit you to write anything else.
Right.
It was only the Quakers who could write different kind of literature. So that is why the literature for a long time before independence came to America continued to be purely Puritan and Calvinist, even at that, throughout New England.
Right. So then the topics were definitely limited.
Yes.
From the range from which one could choose.
Very limited, like free will or man's fall.
Right.
And man's salvage. These were largely the three topics on which most poetry, most prose writings were done. No other topic you
Right.
couldn't think of,
Right.
because they will behead you.
Right. So, sir, around this period, perhaps say 17th century, can we also say that African American literature also developed, or Native American writing was coming into picture?
It had made a beginning, but you can't say it had come in a big way. It came up actually in the 19th century.
Right.
The other day I was reading this 12-Year a Slave. There is a book called 12-Year a Slave, a very great book by Solomon something. He was a free-born black, born in New York, and married with 3-4 children, having a house, well-to-do. But when he was 34 years of age, two white Americans gave him some kind of drug and sold him as a slave. So for 12 years, he went through slavery and he saw what it meant, the kind of torture, the kind of beatings, the kind of starvation one had to go through. He did. Even that book is 1854, I think. Yeah, 1854. When he got out of this 12-year imprisonment, so to say. Then he narrated this, and the book was published in 1854. It has recently been republished. So most American black literature,
Right.
it came out in the 19th century.
19th century.
17th, 18th, I don't think they would be allowed to even write
Right.
or have even benefit of education.
Right.
They were deprived of a civilized life.
Right. Sir, as we talked about that even America had to undergo a struggle for independence because they were of course colonized. So, was there a definite source of revolutionary writing or political writing during that period? Say the same kind of tradition that Indian literature has of resistance.
Well, these Red Indians, poor people, they were brutally suppressed and they were kept like animals in the zoo. Even today, see, even after independence, they don't really enjoy the equal rights.
Yes.
Those days, they were denied everything. They didn't have the benefit of education, benefit of civilization, benefit of voting right, nothing. So these Europeans, unfortunately, wherever they went, they brutally suppressed or killed the native population, even in India,
Yes.
Africa, Asia, wherever they went, they brutally suppressed and called them primitive, uncultured, uncivilized. Of course, Victor always has that advantage. They forget that when they were being ruled by the Romans called them barbarians, called even the Germans barbarians, British, French, all barbarians. Earlier than that, when the Greeks, Alexander and before him, when the Greeks had their empire, they also used to call these British and others barbarians.
Right.
So Victor always has the advantage. Not that we were barbarians. Our civilization is 4,000-5,000 year old, much older than the European civilization.
Yes.
But then because they conquered us, they called us barbarians.
Barbarians.
Similarly, Red Indians.
Right. Sir, it is also believed that during the revolutionary period, some songs came out, some songs, anthems such as Yankee Doodle and so on. And these songs were basically to revolt against the colonizers. And some poems were also written about the war score, say war poems, revolting, and by people such as Francis Hopkinson. And
It actually started with the spread of education. Because with education comes awareness. Then you read all kinds of literature, you read history, you know how people, other civilizations are living. There are free people also. Why should we not be free? But then it is not education alone. There comes affluence. Earlier it was all forest. But then in these 200 years, 17th, 18th century, hard work of these people who went there, they made America a leading country. So much so that the wealth of Britain was primarily drawn from America.
right.
And there came a time when there was a quarrel about taxation policy. If you remember Edmund Burke, before independence, he gave for a week together, long speeches in British Parliament, ranging from 6 to 9 hours every day. And he said, you are being foolish. Don't confront the Americans. Don't levy unreasonable taxes. Otherwise, you will lose America. And finally, they did lose. But then the main source of spreading revolutionary ideas of freedom, there was one book, Tom Paine. Tom Paine wrote a book called Rights of Man. Very revolutionary book. And interestingly, he was an Englishman. But then he migrated to America, started a magazine there, and started spreading these ideas of freedom, and then wrote this book. And this book inspired the Americans, and he told the Americans, why do you continue to be slaves? You are much larger, 20 times the size of England, and much more, rich than Britain is. Why don't you become independent? So he incited people, and finally there were leaders like Franklin, Washington, etc. So they got freedom. And side by side, of course, Tom Paine was the main influence. But Thomas More, if you remember, Utopia.
Yes.
And before that, Plato's Republic. So with education came these books also. And interestingly, Shakespeare's The Tempest, written in 1613. But that is about America, new land. And you remember Gonzalo's Republic? There he has the dream that nature should produce for everybody and equal distribution, so on and so forth. So even Shakespeare could visualize a republic for America. And people took cues from The Tempest, from Thomas More's Utopia, from Plato's Republic, and from Tom Paine's Rights of Man, and it became a movement for freedom.
Right.
Which they finally got in 1776.
Right, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, can we also say that during the 18th century, within the writing, focus was shifted from, say, the puritanical ideas to talking more about the power of the human mind and rational thought, and it was focused more on the human, a human-centered world.
Certainly, yeah. Well, in fact, when America came into being in the 17th century, there were three historical forces contending with each other. One was the medieval orthodoxy. The other was the reformist Puritanism. And the third was Renaissance. And you can find all the three contending in the Elizabethan literature also,
Right.
which was the best product of the Renaissance. In Shakespeare's plays also, you find medieval orthodoxy coming in confrontation with the Renaissance values, because Renaissance revival of the non-Christian literature and philosophy, which means Greco-Roman, pagan, which was pre-Christian. And Greek thought, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and so on, and later the Romans, that is based on reason and logic, because Greeks gave to the world these two tools of thought, rationalism and logic, logical thinking. So, and then came science with Renaissance, the 17th century. So Reformation, medievalism, and Renaissance. These three, Renaissance means rationalism as well as science. So these ideas ultimately they overpowered the Orthodox Christianity, and then even the Reformist Christianity, and gradually it changed to a secular country.
Right. So, sir, can we also say that much of the early literature of, say, the new nation, it struggled to find a uniquely American voice, as they say, the idea of individualism, and it was reflected in the novels, and perhaps the European forms and styles were seen as inferior by critics because they wanted to develop their own new styles in writing in American literature.
Yeah, of course, because when you become conscious of your individual identity, you want to be known by yourself. We will take it up tomorrow. But when America became independent, they became conscious of their separate identity.
Right.
And they thought Europe was an older civilization, and we are new one, energetic one, and we have to find a new path, and therefore discard the older civilization. By the way, there is an interesting story in Hawthorne, who
Right.
comes in this phase
Yes.
of the classic American literature. The story's title is Earth's Holocaust. Now, what happens there is this group of Americans who have come from Europe, and they say we want to establish pure society, free from all sins and follies of the older civilization, and we'll make a new start. We'll set up a society after the Word of God. And they are burning everything, burning all those old titles, and burning even the literature, Shakespeare, Milton, so on and so forth. Then a Hawthorne like skeptic comes. He says, what are you doing? They said, we are erasing our past. We don't want to retain anything of the older civilization, and we want to make a new start. That is why we are burning everything we brought from Europe. Then he asks very slyly, he says, have you thrown your heart also into it? He says, silly, why should we throw our heart into it? He says, if you have not, then everything will follow. He says, do you think the older civilization fell from heavens? It emerged from human desires, emotions, aspirations. All this came from there. So you can't get away. And then finally he says, very soon these new enthusiasts realized that they will have to have two things. One, prison house, and the other, cemetery. Means acknowledging two very basic facts of life, that man is mortal and man is fallible.
Yes.
He is neither perfect nor immortal.
Right.
So prison and the cemetery are symbolic of those two qualities of human nature. So it is very interesting. But this comes in the next phase after the independence.
Right. Post-independence. Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
and in fact, even after independence, it took some time to be yourself,
True.
because independence came in 1776, and this literature, which we call classical American literature, it starts in 1830s,
Right.
1832, with the essays of Emerson.
Right.
So that is where the new identity and the real American literature comes. They don't consider the literature prior to this as American.
Right.
So American literature syllabus or history begins with Emerson.
Right, sir. So then we can say that it was only in the late 18th or 19th century that novel came into being. The nation's first novels came into being, and this also happened because of increase in literacy. There were more number of readers.
Yeah, the true American novelist, Fannie Moore Cooper, as I said, wrote those novels, Leather Stocking. Americans generally begin with him. But in the classical American literature, this group, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, and then Melville, Hawthorne, these five, they constitute the classic American literature. And then other minor ones, Walcott and so on. But it is with them that the real American identity comes about.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So the first novelist that way, some would take Fannie Moore Cooper, others Hawthorne.
Right.
That he makes a beginning.
So, sir, as we know that a lot of novels began in the epistolary style in general. Was that style adopted in the America as well?
No.
No.
No, epistolary started in England, of course,
Yes.
17th and then 18th century. Not in America. America, the American novel is in a way grounded in its own history, in its own settlement. It is inward looking. See, one of the differences, in fact, between the New England, when the novel comes up there, like with Hawthorne,
Yes.
then it becomes outward looking. It will look towards Europe,
Yes.
where from they came and the civilization came. But then the rest of America is inward looking, like Mark Twain.
Yes.
The interior, the culture of the interior anywhere is always inward looking. It's self-contained, and it is a world by itself. It is not aware of the world outside of itself.
Right.
So that is the quality of the American novel, except the New England novel like Hawthorne's.
Hawthorne's, right. Sir, this is perhaps, of course, we are going to discuss in detail more, but could we talk a bit about a few genres that developed, say, like the sentimental genre that came up in American writing? And a popular writer could be Hannah Webster Foster's The Coquette or The History of Eliza Wharton, published in 1797.
Yeah, 17th, 18th century. 2-3 forms of literature besides regular poetry and regular novel came up. One was the short story. In fact, short story, even before it came up in England, it came up in America. So this was one of the genres which was very much native. And these women writers, they were writing short stories plus novels based on their own life, semi-biographical or autobiographical, and entirely local. You see, focused on the conditions of life which they were experiencing. That way, inward looking. So, short story, biography, chronicles, all these forms of literature, they came up in America.
Right.
Not so much in England as in America, because conditions were very different.
Right.
England, part of Europe, and Europe was so much developed, France particularly, and then Italy,
Right.
Greece, ancient literature. So they had such a long history of civilization and literature to look back to and to fall back upon.
Yes.
But America had nothing.
Yes.
And they deliberately wanted to shut off the European past, and therefore they are nothing but look to themselves.
Yes.
So inward looking.
So, sir, as you said, I will just re-articulate. You said that short story developed in America before it did in England.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And so, of course, then English writers have also written short stories. So they took it up from here
Later.
later on.
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, before England, even in New Zealand.
Oh, okay. That's interesting, sir.
Yeah.
New
You
Zealand.
remember that famous female writer? Forgetting that name. We'll take it up tomorrow.
Sir, no problem. I will
Take it up
put a
tomorrow.
reminder.
But short story comes in America and Australia before it comes up in England.
England.
Strangely, although the British discovered both America and Australia
Yes.
and imposed their own language, culture, everything, migrated people. The small tiny island found continents.
Right.
Imagine Canada, America, Australia. If you put these three together, half the world.
Half the world. Yes, quite big in size.
And a handful of Englishmen, they settled and had so much wealth.
Yes, definitely, sir. So, sir, as we talked about, say, short story and sentimental genre, sir, what about picaresque genre? Then this, of course, they may have must have borrowed from English writing.
Yeah, even in England, before England, you remember that first picaresque novel, Don Quixote,
Yes.
Spanish.
Yes.
So that is where actually the genre started, with Don Quixote. And it was then copied in England. You remember in the 18th century, even Tom Jones or Joseph Andrews,
Right.
they are modeled on Don Quixote.
Right. Right.
So this genre actually is Spanish, then British, and then it goes to America.
Right. Right. Sir, even can we say the same about Gothic fiction? Say, did it evolve through a number of places? Because Edgar Allan Poe, he has a number of stories which employ the genre.
entirely.
And
Yeah. Well, you see, it is always the conditions of life, the kind of culture that you have. Ultimately, it will produce its own kind of literature. Now, you could have a picaresque novel in Europe because in Europe the movements could be from one country to another, one place to another,
yes,
which was not the case in America.
America, yes.
America, you see, sea-bound, separated from Europe, and they had nothing to go to except themselves.
True.
So obviously you could not think of the picaresque form of the novel there.
Right.
So that is why sentimental and short story and Gothic, of course.
Yes.
Gothic wonder, magic, and unusual things, old castles. Sorry. So America was the fit place for that.
Right.
Wild. You don't have anything wild left in Europe.
Europe, yes.
But there it was all wild. So you could write those stories.
Right.
Edgar Allan Poe type.
Right, right. So, of course, we are going to discuss this more tomorrow, but can we talk a bit about transcendentalism that came in the late 1820s and 1830s?
Yeah, 1830s largely, because with Emerson. Well, what we call romanticism in Europe becomes transcendentalism in America.
Right.
They did not want to continue with the European name. But the fact is that it came from America.
Right.
From Europe. And one book, single book, which is credited with the induction of these ideas was Coleridge's 1827 book, Aids of Reflection.
Right.
Aids to Reflection.
Right.
Aids to Reflection by S.T. Coleridge. But then Coleridge himself had brought Romanticism from where? From Germany.
Right.
Schlegel brothers. He went there, lived with them, and brought those ideas to England. It was not Wordsworth, it was Coleridge. Wordsworth remained bound. He did, of course, go once. He had an affair with a French girl and so on. But then returned. Coleridge was a philosophic mind. And he was in touch with the philosopher. Germany at that time in the 19th century and late 18th was the center for philosophic ideas. Later it shifted to France. But those days it was Germany. So Coleridge actually went there, lived with those philosophers, Schlegel brothers, and then brought these ideas. That's how Romanticism came.
Right.
And from England it went to America.
Right.
Of course, they also combined another thing, the Indian thought.
Okay, that's interesting, sir.
If you remember Thoreau,
Yes.
Thoreau's Walden,
Yes.
when he speaks of the water in the Walden pond, he says, when I put my hands into the water there in the Walden, he says the water of the Ganges
Right.
mixes there. He
Yes.
says it is the same water. He means spiritual.
Yes.
So the Indian thought, Indian spiritualism also went into the American transcendentalism.
Right.
Of course, it is a kind of revival because they forget the Germans also got these ideas from the Indian thought.
Right.
You remember they translated our Vedic literature,
Yes.
Vedas, Shastras, from Sanskrit into German,
German.
and German into French and then English. And these ideas, the roots of Romanticism actually are Oriental, are Indian. So from India to Germany to Europe, the rest of Europe to America, that is the root. And it is European Romanticism is nothing but another name to Indian spiritualism.
Right. Right, sir. Right. That's quite interesting to know that what the English called Romanticism is what the Americans call Transcendentalism.
Yes.
So it is the same.
And actually it is Indian spiritualism,
Right.
which gets different names in different places.
Right. Right. Of course, we've had a very fruitful discussion and a lot of ideas have come up within that, but as we draw to the close of the lecture, we shall have to wrap up. But before that, I would like to tell you that in the next lecture with the same subject expert, we are going to discuss classical American literature, and I hope you all will be prepared for that. You could do some preliminary readings in order to understand the area better.
Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman primarily, because these are the three prescribed in
Right.
every
Right. We
MA
will.
syllabus. And American literature really means this literature,
Right.
because generally we begin with this.
Right. sir.
Earlier we don't count as
Yes.
American.
Yes, sir. So as sir said, we will be discussing the those particular writers in detail. So let us thank sir for being here, and we request him to see us soon and talk about classic American literature. With that, we thank him, and also thank you viewers for watching. Have a very nice day.